This is the Flyerdelphia podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome into another episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined once again by Rob Riches and Dan Heaning. And this week, we continue what we started a week ago after conducting a fantasy draft involving some of the greatest players in Flyers franchise history. This week, we're going to look back at the 50-year history of the Flyers and look at some of the best games, moments, some of the personal memories that we have growing up as Flyers fans and eventually coming to this point in our lives where we are discussing Flyers hockey with each other, presenting that to you, our readers, our listeners, and everything that has brought us to that point as Flyers fans and now writers and people covering the team. So let's get started, and we're going to start with our top 5 greatest games in Flyers history. And Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us your top 5 list.
Kevin, when you look at the 50-year history of the Philadelphia Flyers, it's kind of funny when you have to take a look at the top 5 games in franchise history. Between regular season, playoff games, I mean, God only knows there have just been so many. It's hard to pick just 5. That's a pretty Herculean task. But the game I'll kick off with is the 1976 game against the Soviet Red Army. And I think that considering the geopolitical climate at the time between this country and the Soviet Union and just how they came over and ran roughshed across the entire league and how the Flyers basically silenced them with Ed Van Impe's elbow in the first period. It was just one of those games where the Flyers had a reputation as the Broad Street Bullies, as the pro wrestling heels of the league, basically. But for one night, the league turned to them as the saviors, basically, and they more than answered the call. Number 4, I would say, is Game 6 in 2012, the first round against Pittsburgh, taking down the heavily favored Penguins. Number 3, I have in 2010, completing the comeback. Or actually, that's number 2. Number 3 is Game 6 against Toronto, in 2004, and Jeremy Roenick's overtime winning goal sent the Flyers to the Eastern Conference Final. And number 1, I have the 1974 Stanley Cup Final against Boston, where the Flyers won their first ever Stanley Cup and basically put the stamp on one of, if not the greatest eras in franchise history.
All right, so Rob, again, we'll just kind of run down. You had the Soviet Army game. You had Game 6 of the Penguins series in 2012. You had number 3, Game 6 of the 2004 Eastern Conference semifinal against Toronto. Number 2, you said, was the final game of the series against Boston in 2010, and then the Stanley Cup final clincher in 74 as the number 1.
Is the 1976 Soviet Red Army game pretty low? It's probably lower than it should be, but that's what I'll go with for now.
And I think it's fair. I think it's totally fair. And let's go ahead, and Dan, what do you have for your top 5?
I'll start my top 5 with Game 7 of the 2010 Eastern Conference semifinals against the Boston Bruins. Now, you can only pick one game from this series and just tell the story. The whole story can be told in Game 7. Flyers go down 3-0. It looks bleak. It looks like all of the work that they put forth to make this historic comeback a reality, it's going to go all for naught, as the Bruins just looked red hot. But then the Flyers did what they had done during the series. They slowly came back. A really fluke goal by James Van Riemsdyk gets the Flyers back into the game, just as Peter Laviolette told them it would when he called the timeout. Just get me one goal, is what he told them. Then goals by Scott Hartnell and Danny Briere tie the game. And then it's won in a typical Boston Bruins fashion on a too-many-men penalty. And Simone Gagne, who had been the catalyst for the whole comeback, scores the game-winning goal. So that's 5. 4, I agree with Rob, the game against the USSR. That was one of the most landmark games, not only for the Philadelphia Flyers, but in hockey. As he said, the Flyers were the foils of the NHL. Nobody liked the way they played. And it was a game that may not have been completed had Ed Snyder not threatened to not pay the team. So they had to, play the rest of the game if they wanted to actually get paid for getting beat up by the Flyers. For number 3, I'm going to go ahead with the 5 overtime game where Keith Primo scores. I remember watching that game, and we can get to that at a later segment. It was just a war of attrition. I was watching some highlights earlier today, and you could just tell in the 5th overtime that the Pittsburgh Penguins are so beat. And Keith Primo just pulled off a move. He had only scored 1 goal in the entire playoff prior to that. And he just lets loose this shot that ends the game. My number 2, I'm going to go with the series-clinching win against the Buffalo Sabres in 1975. It's always good to win a Stanley Cup. It's even better to win 2 in a row. Even if the game itself kind of takes a backseat to the moment of lifting the Stanley Cup over your head, it's still a landmark game for the Philadelphia Flyers. And obviously, the top one is going to be in the 1974 series, and I kind of wrestled with the clinching one. But since Rob already took it, I wanted to take a different angle, and I'm going to go with Game 2, where the Flyers won in overtime against the Boston Bruins 3-2. If the Flyers don't win that game, they're not winning the series. They needed to win 1 game in Boston to win that series, because they would not win a game series if they had to go back to Beantown. And winning that game in overtime just put the Flyers in the driver's seat, and they didn't relinquish it for the rest of the series.
So Dan's top 5 were the clinching game, Game 7 of the 2010 Eastern Conference semifinal against Boston, then the Soviet Red Army game, then the 5 overtime game, and then at number 2 he had Game 6 of the 1975 Stanley Cup final, where the Flyers won their 2nd consecutive Stanley Cup, and then had Game 2 of the 74 Stanley Cup final as his number 1. So that brings it to my list. And I also, at number 5, have the Soviet Red Army game. You know, it's a game that always stands out. You always hear about it, even though it was far before our time. And it should stand out, because you see the hit that Ed Van Impe puts onto a Soviet player, and instantly you're looking at it and going, it's like conquering something that seemed impossible. It was such a defining moment for the Flyers, and to see that, and the way that the rest of the game turned out, and given the fact that, truth be told, the way the Soviets had gone through the rest of the NHL to that point, playing in this series that they were doing, going around to all the NHL teams, the Flyers were the only one that could stand up to them because of the fact that they played that style. So it was such a defining win, and everybody's right. For a change, that was one of those games where the entire hockey world, the entire, anybody who was an NHL fan, was on the Flyers side that day. And for the Flyers to come out with that kind of victory, it is a franchise-defining victory, no question about it. Number 4, I have also the 2010 Game 7 against the Boston Bruins. And for me, I remember particularly when Game 4 rolled around in that series. I mean, again, we are going to get into some of our own memories of these things, but I'm going to touch on this one now while we're talking about this game. And the night of Game 4, I went to a Phillies game because there was no reason to really get hyped up about the Flyers at that point. They were down 3-0 in the series, and yeah, they still needed to Boston still needed to win the 4th game. That's obvious. It takes 4, but the odds were so stacked against the Flyers for the rest of that series that at least during Game 4, you didn't think it mattered that much, so you kind of planned accordingly for other things. Maybe you did something different. I was already sitting on tickets to another event, so I went ahead and went because, quite honestly, you were thinking, what happens if Handshakes come later tonight, and I didn't do something else to watch them get knocked out of the playoffs. They win that game in overtime. They go through the rest of the series. They win Game 5 in Boston convincingly. They hold on for the win in Game 6, and all of a sudden, Game 7 is this massive game where the comeback trail is on. And I didn't get the chance to watch the first period of that game. So by the time I got a score update, it was 3-0, and then they got the 1 goal. And you watch the game again over, and you see that moment in the timeout that Peter Laviolette has, telling him, just 1 goal, just get 1 here, and we can make this happen. And they get the 1. It was as fluky as ever, but after they get that 1, look how quickly they got themselves back into it. They got a second 1 fairly early in the second period. They evened things up midway through the period, and then that was probably among the most agonizing next few minutes of a game that I've ever watched. Going through the entire rest of the second period and most of the third period to that point before the too many men penalty that Boston takes that gives the Flyers the man advantage that ultimately gives them the game-winning goal. And then the moments after that, too. You can have a one-goal lead, and it doesn't matter because your heart's still, in your stomach, and it's agonizing to watch a team try to hold on, especially when you've seen them get beat down before by the opponent for 3 games to start the series, and now you're just waiting for the other, you're waiting for something bad to happen, and it didn't happen. I think one of the most standout points of this game was Claude Giroux's shift toward the end of the game where he protects the puck for 30, 45 seconds just in the offensive zone, and he's just protecting the puck. He can barely control it with his stick, but he's holding off Boston players, and that's a standout moment to me in that game. Just because of the fact, Simone Gagne's goal on the power play there is going to be something that lives forever in Flyers history, no question about it. But just as important as that was the shift that Giroux had at the end of the game and the fact that they held off Boston with the net empty, things like that. So a perfect capper to the series, and that started really a crazy ride, and we'll get into that more as we go on throughout the show, I'm sure. My number 3 game is Game 6 of the 1987 Stanley Cup Final, otherwise known as the night the Spectrum shook. You just go and you watch the highlights and you watch clips, and to be trailing in a game where the Stanley Cup is in the building, waiting to be claimed by the Edmonton Oilers once again, and you get a goal from Brian Propp, and then not too much longer after, of all people, you get a guy like J.J. Daigneault to score a goal. It was kind of unexpected. He's not a usual scoring suspect, if you will, and you get this goal that totally brings the crowd that was already to life with a tie game. It just makes them even crazier because of the fact that now they're ahead, and there's not that much time left. It's going to feel like a lot of time. You're talking 7-8 minutes still left in that game, but it's, there's not a lot of time left. And now Edmonton, with all of their firepower, with Gretzky, with Messier, have to find a way to put it together and see if they can get an equalizer in their effort to try to win the Stanley Cup in Game 6, and it doesn't happen. And just a part of that team, so many different people on that team, so many different players on that team who were so important to Flyers history, especially over that decade, and being able to see that team get to the cusp of winning a Stanley Cup. Even though it didn't happen in the next game, that particular game just stands out. My number 2 is Keith Primo scoring the goal in the 5th overtime against Pittsburgh. When you get a marathon like that, which is exactly what it was, losing a game like that is incredibly difficult to deal with and to come back and to feel like, you hear the stories about how these players were just depleted on energy. The fact that they had nothing left, they're ordering pizza in between periods, overtime periods, to try to still have some energy. So they can go out there and somebody's got to eventually score a goal. There were posts in overtime. There were close calls. And, watching one overtime in a playoff hockey game is already enough to make you go insane. It really is. You could be losing years off your lifetime watching some of these games, especially if you watch enough of them. Now try doing a 5 overtime game. You get hit double overtime, triple overtime. You're already agonizing through it. You get to 4 or 5, that's extreme. That's crazy. So the relief that comes when Keith Primo scores a goal, and what a magnificent goal it was, too, that's an image that's going to stand forever in Flyers history. For that game to end that way, and then for the Flyers to take that, win that series, move on to the Eastern Conference Final, and really carry that momentum through Game 4 of that series. We're not going to try to put a damper on things and go into some of the negatives too much, but obviously things took a turn after that, but they really rolled after that game to being right on the cusp of getting to the Stanley Cup Final. And then my number 1, like Rob, is Game 6 of the 74 Stanley Cup Final. Truth be told, it's one of those games, I think the first time I ever saw kind of the full replay of that game, when you're a kid and you watch that, I guess in the moment, if you were watching a game like that, if you were a kid in 1974 and you're watching that, yeah, you're living with it because of the fact that you know exactly what's at stake. But to watch the replay, to know how it ends, to be quite honest, from a scoring standpoint, it's a 1-0 game. There's not a whole lot of excitement when it comes to scoring. But when you learn to have appreciation, especially as you watch more games and you get older, when you have an appreciation for what a 1-0 game is, and especially when you watch the way that Bernie Parent played in that game, you get such an appreciation for how that game turned out and everything about it, especially since the Flyers had the 1-0 lead after the first period. To play with that lead for 2 more periods, full periods, and have to hold off the Bruins, who at that point in time, were going to be heavy favorites in that series. Look at how Dan talked about Game 2, and he's right. The Flyers don't win Game 2, we're not talking about Game 6. But the reason we can talk about Game 6 is because of Bobby Clark scoring in Game 2. Even before that, too, talking about Andre Dupont scoring to tie the game in Game 2, then Bobby Clark scoring in overtime, and then you get to Game 6, and you're talking about the Flyers winning the Stanley Cup because of Bernie Parent and a nice deflection by Rick McLeish. And that is, by far, I would think, the defining moment of this franchise, winning their first Stanley Cup.
The thing about that Game 6 in 1974 is that I am very reluctant, kind of as a personal principle and philosophy, that goalie shutouts are quite overrated. I mean, I love watching the shutout, but it's not necessarily an indictment of the goalie's effort as much as it is an indictment of the defense in front of them, and it's a team effort for the most part. But I think Bernie Parent's play in that game is an exception to the rule. He was an absolute maestro. It was something almost unlike anything else, any other. He was incredible in Game 6, and watching footage from that game, it's just hard to believe. I mean, there's a reason why he was considered one of the best, if not the best, of his era, and it's games like that served as a testament.
So we reviewed some of the best games. Next up, we'll talk about some of the best moments in Flyers history, so stick around here on the Flyerdelphia podcast. You're listening to the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com. So after discussing some of the best games as a whole in Flyers history, we're going to turn our attention to some of the moments that stand out in Flyers history. And these could be moments that defined a game that as a whole wasn't as memorable. The games that we just talked about were collectively, from start to finish, games that people remember, games that you'll see replayed in full or mostly in full. Now, these next moments are going to be things that stand out on their own over the course of a short portion of a game, not necessarily a whole game. So, Rob, again, why don't you start us off and give us your top 5?
Well, I do have the top 5, Kevin, and I have a bonus one that I'll throw in there. Which
That's perfect. Let's hear it.
We'll do that. But
you want to give us your top 5 first and then do the bonus?
Of course, yeah.
Perfect. Let's go ahead.
But moments that I think of, number 5 was J.J. Daigneault's goal, and the thing in Game 6 in 1987. And the funny thing about that goal is that he was out there on the ice for a lengthier shift, and he was actually looking to get off the ice and get Mark Howe on. And so he turns around to head to the bench, and Howe's waving him off. I think Mike Keenan was waving off too. They're telling him to stay out there. So he turns back around, gets the puck at the point, throws it through traffic, and next thing you know, it's in the back of the net. It's incredible how close that goal came to not happening, although if he was getting off the ice in favor of Mark Howe, I mean, there was a pretty good chance that puck was going in the back of the net. Number 4, again, I have the first round of the 2012 playoffs against Pittsburgh. That's just more or less the series as a whole, and I say that there is some recency bias there, but as of now, that's the last time the Flyers won a playoff series. And I was actually on hand to witness Game 6 of that series, and that still stands as the best game I think I've ever been to. It was just, the atmosphere was incredible. If you haven't been to Wells Fargo Center for a playoff game, do yourself a favor and get there the next time you can, because it's just as intense and as great as Flyer games are in person during the regular season. It's just on a whole other level for the playoffs. Number 3, I have Ed Van Imp's elbow in the first period of that Soviet Red Army game. That, along with Rocky IV, ended the Cold War. Ended discussion. Number 2, I have what became known as the shift, where it was Mike Richards in Game 5 of the 2010 Eastern Conference Final, and it's funny when you look back on that Eastern Final on paper. You have a 7 and an 8 seed, and Flyers and Montreal going toe to toe, and you think on paper, okay, these are two teams that may not be the best teams going at it, but that's just kind of how the cards play it out, and you have Mike Richards, who was just an absolute tour de force on the penalty kill. I mean, he was unlike any other, and as you're throwing his body around as the Canadians try to pressure, and as the Flyers go to clear the puck the length of the ice, Yaroslav Halak makes the ill-advised decision to come out and play the puck, but Richards hustled 110% of the way down ice to poke the puck loose and tap it into the empty net while Halak's stick was kind of spinning in his way. And number one was Dave Poulin's goal in 1985, another shorthanded goal. But that's when the Flyers, again, they were a scrappier young team. This was Mike Keenan's first year as the Sheriff. Nobody really knew what to expect from him that year. But you have Poulin, who, while killing a 5-on-3, ends up tracking the puck down on a breakaway, taking it and going high to the glove side on a Mario Gosselin, one of those goals that stands out as one of the best in franchise history, and it's still to this day. And I'll go back and I'll watch that every once in a while. Just an absolutely incredible play, and just an absolute statement, I think, from the young Flyer captain. And the bonus Flyers moment that I teased, I'm not going to say it's the best moment in franchise history, and I'm not going to say it's the worst moment in franchise history, but I will say it's the most Flyers moment in franchise history. It was in the regular season, I think in the 2000-2001 season, in a game against Toronto, where a fan was giving it to noted Flyer killer Ty Domi in the penalty box, and got a little too hands-on and fell into the penalty box. At the time it happened, I mean, it was an instant blooper reel clip, and it's still funny to watch to this day. And, obviously we know the reputation that Philadelphia fans get, which is mostly undeserved, but that clip was pretty funny, and it's a situation I hope none of us find ourselves in, especially against a guy like Ty Domi.
My list isn't so much a top 5 in terms of historical value of the Philadelphia Flyers over the 50 years that they've been a franchise. Mine is just more of something that, having watched this team for so long, these were just moments that when I think of this organization, when I think of the Philadelphia Flyers, they stand out to me. So the first one I'm going to dive into is November 10th, 1996, Ron Hextall versus Felix Potvin. This was just, a run-of-the-mill regular season game. The Flyers were winning 3-1. There was no contesting the end result. The Flyers were going to win. But Toronto Maple Leafs captain Doug Gilmour wasn't very happy with Rod Brind'Amour, with the way he had been hit by Rod Brind'Amour, and he started to chirp a lot. He was complaining on the bench. He was giving the refs some business, and that boiled over to the rest of the team as they started, going after each other. And then what had happened is, before all of the zaniness happened in this game, Terry Murray sent out Dan Kordick and Scott Daniels to deal with Ty Domi. Well, as you imagined, people started fighting. Once that cooled down, they played another shift, and everyone thought that was over. Everybody got their aggression out. Then Dan Lacroix leans into a Toronto player. Believe it was Wendell Clark. Wendell Clark is a player that can handle himself, and he starts pummeling Lacroix. That's when Felix Potvin decides he's going to get into it, and Ron Hextall skates the length of the ice, and they just grab each other, just start pummeling each other. Felix Potvin actually gets Hextall's jersey over his head, and Hextall just essentially rips it off so he can just keep punching away at Felix Potvin. And this was the type of animosity that would lead to future Flyers Leafs games. For instance, the 1999 playoff series against the Toronto Maple Leafs had a very intense ending, as John LeClair was given an elbowing penalty, which ended with a Sergei Brizin power play goal that won the series for Toronto. And Ed Snyder was not at all happy. He blamed the officials for the series loss, as did some of the Flyers like LeClair. And then the instance that Rob mentioned of the fan trying to fight Ty Domi, of all people. My next moment The season before that, the Philadelphia Flyers had not been good for a little bit in the 90s. It looked like they were going to turn a corner in 1994. They just didn't have enough defense or goaltending to actually, have the crazy 8-line get them into the playoffs. In 1995, when they traded for John LeClair and Eric Desjardins, they found themselves in the playoffs. They defeated the Buffalo Sabres, and now they found themselves in a second-round matchup with the defending Stanley Cup champions, the New York Rangers. Anyone could see that this might be a problem for the Flyers because the Rangers had just knocked out the number 1 overall seed in the Quebec Nordiques. In this game 1, the Flyers were down by 2 goals twice, 2-0 and 3-1. John LeClair scored a hat trick, and Eric Desjardins scored in the third to put the Flyers up 4-3 in a big comeback. But Pat Verbeek had tied the game 4-4 late in the third period. So now we're setting up to a certain play that Eric Desjardins would finish the game off with after a little pick. I don't remember who the player was, but the screen was being set by Craig McTavish. And so Eric Desjardins was able to end that game and put the Flyers on the map in terms of this is not going to be, we're not going to just roll over and lose to the defending Stanley Cup champions. We're here to give them a fight, and they would wind up sweeping them. My next moment is John LeClair scoring 50 goals twice against the New Jersey Devils. Anybody who lived through the 90s as a Philadelphia Flyers fan, the New Jersey Devils were the bane of your existence. So to see John LeClair get 50 goals twice for the first time in franchise history since Tim Kerr was something to see. One of them was a game-tying goal. It was a pretty meaningless game, but it did boost the Flyers in 1997 for their run in the 1997 Stanley Cup Finals, in which they would move past Mario Lemieux and the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then a Dominic Hasek-less Buffalo Sabres. But that was just something that always stuck out to me because it was a moment where John LeClair was able to put himself into Philadelphia Flyers history. Now, another moment that really stood out to me. I think it's one of the most defining moments in the Flyers' history in terms of the 1990s when Eric Lindros muscles himself past Mark Messier to give the Flyers a 3-1 series lead in the Eastern Conference Final. It's a significant play because it has this signal that Eric Lindros is passing Mark Messier because it's a pretty obvious hook, but he moves himself right past Messier. It's almost like how they had talked about when Lindros had shook hands with Mario Lemieux. It was sort of a passing of the torch. Well, this one looked like it was Lindros ripping the torch away from Mark Messier and putting the Flyers in a position to claim a Game 5, which Rod Brind'Amour would score 2 goals and put the Flyers in the Stanley Cup Final for the first time since 1987. So that stood out to me because it's just a moment that when you see it, you could see it. You saw it all over the place. You saw it on NHL 98 for the PlayStation 1. It was just a great play in my eyes. I guess my last moment is the 2009-2010 season, all of it, because it was such an intriguing season. It was no other season I'd ever experienced as a hockey fan. You have so much expectation going in that with the Flyers acquiring Chris Pronger at the draft. You have the goaltending being filed out. Marty Biron was not a bad goaltender for the Flyers in the previous few years, but he wanted too much money. They got him out of there. Niittymaki never turned himself into the goaltender they thought he would be, so they replaced him with Ray Emery, and Brian Boucher came back. With a lot of expectation, now John Stevens had to go from being a coach that was developing talent to a coach that had to win now. And it looked like things were going okay because they mustered a 5-game win streak, but they were still always kind of hovering over slightly over 500, and it wasn't good enough for where the Flyers thought they would be. So he wound up getting fired, and then Laviolette gets hired, and you think things are going to turn around, but then they start tanking again, and it doesn't seem like there's any end to it. Ray Emery's getting hurt. Ray Emery misses a significant amount of time, so Brian Boucher has to play. And it's not even like Brian Boucher isn't playing well. It's just that the Flyers can't score. But then they get Michael Layton, this waiver claim out of nowhere that comes in, and all of a sudden the Flyers can score. They're getting good goaltending, and the sky's the limit. This team is now making a run at the playoffs. but then Michael Layton gets hurt. And then the team starts falling off again because for whatever reason, the Flyers couldn't score with Brian Boucher in the net. And this isn't even me talking about the shootout against New York Rangers, the playoff in itself, which we could talk about that all night. So it was such a fascinating season from the start of the puck on opening night to what happened in the Stanley Cup Final in Game 6.
All right, so I'm going to do mine now, and my top 5 moments, I'll do the same. I have a top 5 and then kind of a bonus. So number 5 for me, I have down as in 1973, Gary Dornhover's overtime goal against the Minnesota North Stars. Main reason I put that down is because of the fact that if you watch kind of those video montages that they show of this franchise's history, that's one of the first video highlights you really get the chance to see. That goal, it's immortalized with the statue, things like that, and it's set the tone for the Flyers to win their first ever playoff series. It wasn't a series clincher, but it set the tone, and that alone makes it one of those moments. So I'll put that down as number 5. Number 4 is Ron Hextall scoring a goal. To think that a goalie could actually stop the puck, shoot, and score was unheard of, and here's Ron Hextall who comes in. Yeah, he's a little unorthodox with some of the things that he does, but he was successful. He's in the middle of having, one of the best seasons, that he could have. He was fresh off of the Stanley Cup appearance from the year before, and it's December of 1987, and he's just going to fire away. And the thing is that as everybody's watching this game, or as you got people who are broadcasting the game, they'll sit there and watch and go, it wouldn't be a shock if he ever tried to just shoot the puck. And moments later, there he goes, and he shoots, and it's right down center ice over everybody, rolls in, and he's got a goal. It's incredible. It's another one they show on a loop, and it's just one of the coolest things to see. A goalie in all that gear, the masked man in net, stop the puck, shoot, and score. It was just so cool. My number 3 is the shift by Mike Richards in the Game 5 of the 2010 Eastern Conference Final against Montreal. And when you watch a player like Mike Richards, who as a captain of the team at that time, steps up and makes a play like that, and again, it's a shorthanded situation. He already kicks it off with a good shorthanded scoring chance and a big hit along the board, so the tone's already been set. We talk about the Giroux shift a little bit and how the Giroux shift starts with the hit on Sidney Crosby right off the faceoff, and then culminates with the goal. In Mike Richards' case, it starts similarly. He gives a forearm shiver along the boards and goes up on a 2-on-1, and yeah, they don't capitalize on that part of it, but you get a clearing attempt that takes a good bounce. Richards is in the clear a little bit. He starts going forward. Yaroslav Halak's coming charging out of the net to try to make a play on it. He collides with Roman Hamrlik. Richards squeezes between the two of them. The puck goes toward the net, and he's got a wide open net, and the place is going bonkers. It's such a standout moment, and that really, you got to remember, the Flyers were trailing in the game 1-0 at the time, too. So to turn the game around with that one play says a lot about that play in franchise history. My number 2 is Dave Poulin's shorthanded goal, 5-on-3, in the Eastern Conference Final in 1985. And again, to me, I think the moment, and Rob touched on a lot of parts on this moment before, it's a clinching game in the playoffs to get the Flyers to the Stanley Cup Final. And to me, I think the thing that stands out even more than just what it led to is the call. All I can hear whenever I think about Dave Poulin, all I can hear is Gene Hart saying, he's going right on in. That's all I think about. And, for a goal like that to come at that time, for that team. What timing? Again, it's another captain moment, so I think that stands out in itself too. And for where it got the Flyers after that game, Dave Poulin scoring down 2 men in the middle of that game, and at the end of that game, he's skating around with the Prince of Wales trophy. So that's another standout for me. And then my number 1 is Jeremy Roenick's overtime goal in the Eastern Conference semifinal in 2004. And the reason I picked that as kind of a top is because we could look at that moment alone from the 2-on-1 with Roenick and Tony Amani and the goal itself. But I don't want to do that. I want to go back probably about 3 or 4 minutes. It's early in the overtime, and so much is happening. The big hit on Sami Kapanen. It's Darcy Tucker who levels Kapanen into the boards. Sami Kapanen can't get up. He doesn't know where he is. And you've got Keith Primo stretching onto the ice to try to lasso him onto the bench to get him off the ice. That allows the Flyers to complete a line change. In the meantime, the puck is down the other end of the ice, and there's some tense moments around Robert Esche at that point. So it very easily, in a Game 6 where the Flyers are facing either win the series now or it comes back to Philadelphia for Game 7, you got tense moments in the defensive zone. You got the Flyers trying to get another player. So it's essentially a power play for Toronto until they can get Kapanen off the ice. They do. Roenick's able to come on the ice. And then you get that fortunate play where it's a nice pass off the boards. And there goes Roenick. And the intensity of the moment, the hellacious nature of that whole overtime. And they have, the glorious part about games, especially in recent history, is that you can watch it in all its glory on YouTube and see every ounce of that whole situation. The hit on Kapanen, them trying to get him off the ice, a couple of 2-on-1 chances, because there's one with Mark Recchi at one point in time. He doesn't score. You got Ed Belfour in goal, who was a great goalie in his day and is toward the end of his career at that point, but still, things like that. It was just so hectic, and it was exactly what playoff overtime hockey is. So I think that stands up to me as easily one of the top moments that I'll ever remember watching in Flyers history and just in general too. And then my bonus comes from the 2000 playoff run. And again, in a series that, we talked about how the Flyers got off to such a good start in the Eastern Conference Final, and then the series kind of goes downhill from there. But one of the moments that I think you have to pinpoint from that entire series is Brian Boucher making the save with his mask coming off on Patrick Elias on a breakaway, and just that image is another one that's etched forever in Flyers lore. To watch him, especially at that time too, you think about how goalies were. We talked about this with the 74 season and talking about Bernie Parent. You think about how goalies were padded then and equipped then, and then look at Boucher and the way that they don't allow play to proceed when a goalie doesn't have his mask on, things like that. And he's going to sell out, make the stop, his helmet's falling off, his mask goes flying, and what a standout moment, what a save. And I think that the moment, it still makes you go wow to this day, I think.
I think that the funny thing about that 2004 goal against Toronto is, like you said, how that goal is available in all its glory on YouTube, and every once in a while I go back and I watch that, and the Flyers were completely out of steam. If you watch that, just the pressure that the Maple Leafs were mounting, the Flyers they just couldn't answer the bell, and you have the Flyers are clearing the zone, and it looked like it wasn't a matter of if the Leafs would win in OT, it was when the goal would be scored. But you have the Flyers, clearing the puck out of their zone, and Belfour realizing, because at the time there wasn't the rule about no changing on icing, so the Flyers are trying to get a break, and they're clearing, from past the red line, and Belfour smartly realizing, they're trying to get off, so I'm going to do what I can to keep the puck in play, and there was no trapezoid there. He had that in his court, and it's just, and then obviously Sammy Kapanen just getting annihilated into the boards. It really looked like it wasn't going to go the Flyers' way, but they end up getting that 2-on-1 with Roenick and Amani, and Roenick goes top cheddar, knocks the water bottle right off, and sends the Flyers right into the Eastern Conference Final.
All right, so now that we've talked about some of the great games, some of the great moments, we're going to now go into our own personal experiences when we come back on the podcast. So stick with us here on the Flyerdelphia podcast. We'll come back with some of our favorite personal moments and some of the things that helped us become big Flyers fans that got us to where we are right now, talking Flyers hockey on a podcast for all of you. So stick around. We'll be back on the Flyerdelphia podcast.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
So to close out our show this week, now that we've talked about the games, we've talked about the moments that so many Flyers fans would recognize, we're going to talk about a few personal memories, and these are the games, the moments, the plays, anything really that we can remember that stand out to us, not so much as top 5 moments in franchise history or things that define the franchise's history or games that do. But moments that stand out for us in our formative years in becoming Flyers fans and what led us to be providing written content and coming on here every week and talking Flyers hockey for all of you. So Rob, lead us off again. Any good stories or good memories that you have as a Flyers fan growing up?
One of the earliest Flyers memories I have was a seemingly meaningless game in the 1997-98 season. Or I think it was actually the 98-99 season. It was Flyers versus Blues. I remember watching this game. This was when Roger Nielsen was behind the bench. And he was just, not a lot was going the Flyers' way. He was just getting frustrated at a few of the refs' calls. And I actually remember him going up to the stick rack. I think he grabbed one of Mark Recchi's sticks and just chucked it onto the ice in protest. And, you know, Nielsen, he's been known for that kind of stuff. Obviously, I think one of his top things was, or one of his top moments was waving the towel when he was in Vancouver in 1982. But, you know, he was a very fiery guy. And, you know, I just remember that sticking out for whatever reason. It was just funny as a kid, I guess, to watch. And, you know, I was getting into the Flyers well before that, but that's just an early memory that for some reason I have. Another one that stands out to me was when Dan touched on the entire 2009-10 season. I actually remember going to Game 1 of that, their first game against the Devils up at the Prudential Center. I went up there with my dad, and that's just something where, you know, he just decided to kind of spur the moment to find tickets, you know, found tickets cheap enough, and that was my first time going to a game in an opposing arena, and it was my first time going to a playoff game, and the Flyers ended up winning that one 2-1, and you look at the box score for that one, they were heavily outshot 24-14. They can only muster 14 shots on goal all game, and they still came out with a 2-1 win. Another that I'll touch on was also from 1998, was the April Fool's Day game where Eric Lindros ended up leaving with a collapsed lung, and that's something that I can kind of see as the beginning of the end of the Lindros era, because, you know, there were tensions between the Lindros faction, House Lindros, I guess you can call it, and the Flyers front office and Bobby Clark, and, you know, have the Flyers, they just wanted to send him on a plane back from Nashville to Philly, and, you know, how, because they didn't realize at the time that he had a collapsed lung, and training staff was with Mark Recchi at the hospital, who I believe had a concussion. So it was very evident that something was wrong with Lindros, but it nearly cost him his life, and that's something that I look back on as kind of the beginning of the end of the Lindros run of dominance in Philadelphia.
All right. Dan, what about you?
At least in terms of my younger years, I remember way back before there was a Comcast Sportsnet, there was a channel that you had to pay for called Prism, and that's how you watch the Flyers for the most part. And I remember going into the living room to ask my mom if we could get that for the 1996-97 season. And for whatever reason, she said yes. So for that one season, I remember being, you know how all you crazy kids like Pokemon? When I was, for the 1996-97 season, I was hunting down Flyers games because the Flyers back then were on so many different channels. They were on Prism. They were on UPN.
Yeah.
Philly 57.
UPN 57.
That's right.
And they were on this channel that nobody remembers. I'm surprised. I'll be surprised if you guys remember it. Philly Sports Channel.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't remember that at all.
Vaguely.
It was only on in, I guess, the Philadelphia market. It wasn't on in my market because I was living down in the shore area of New Jersey, and so the only way I could watch it is to visit relatives up in the Poconos. And I remember going up there to watch a game against the Hartford Whalers. I believe the Flyers crushed them. It was back when they played it. The Hartford Whalers played in the mall, essentially is what they called it, because there was a bunch of other stuff you could do there. But that was it. And that season, they went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. And it was almost impeccable timing, because I had been crushed the year before when they lost to the Florida Panthers in the 1996 playoff. And the first game was against Florida. So I'm like, here comes the bouncing ball of justice. And they lost that game, but they made it all the way to the final. And I know I prattled on a little bit on that one, so I'll just give you another story that's actually... I got stories where I can talk about, taking my little sisters to games, going with my aunt to my first game at Philadelphia. I've been to a ton of games, but one thing that really stuck out to me is you guys in the last section, you guys talked about the 2003-04 season. I didn't see a minute of that, of the playoff, because I was in April. I went to boot camp, and so I missed the whole playoff. And I was actually struggling in boot camp early on because I wasn't passing my swim tests. I wasn't doing this. I wasn't doing that. Getting yelled at. That's what boot camp is. And at one point, my aunt sent me a newspaper clip that the Flyers had beaten the New Jersey Devils in the first round. And that was like, it turned everything around. I'm like, if they could beat the Devils, I can do this. Because if you were a 90s kid as a Flyers fan, as I said before, the Devils were the bane of your existence. And they could never beat them. And so for this one time, and of course I miss it, they did. They beat the Devils. And then in that same clip, I saw that they had beaten the Toronto Maple Leafs. So now they're in the Eastern Conference Final. And now I'm thinking, I got to get out of here. I got to get to where there's a TV because they're in the Eastern Conference Final. And as the end of, now everything's rectified in boot camp. I'm passing my tests. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. We get to a point when you're done, you get to use the internet again. You can call your relatives and all that. And I was checking the internet, and I saw that the Flyers had forced a Game 7 with Simone Gagne scoring the game-winning goal. And I was shocked because I thought I could actually watch this playoff run. If they win Game 7 and make it to the Stanley Cup Final, I can watch them. And of course it didn't happen, but it was just that connection that even though I didn't see a minute of that playoff, it was that connection that they were doing well, and it motivated me to do better. And that's why I continue to watch this team, even though Flyers fans like to say oh, why was I born in Philadelphia? Every step of the way, I've had a moment with this team where it gets me through a jam, or it gets me through those bad times, and that's something that'll stick with me for a long time.
Before I start with mine, kind of with some of my things too, the first thing I was going to say in terms of some of mine, I'll actually pitch the question to both of you guys in this case, so all three of us can answer this, and because Dan, you just touched on it yourself, actually. You guys remember your first game in attendance?
I know it was in Madison Square Garden because my entire family are comprised of Rangers fans. I hadn't actually gone to Philadelphia for a game until I was well into my teens. And I'd been to a couple in a row in Madison Square Garden where I probably couldn't narrow it down for you. I know they lost because everybody loses their first game. That's my rule. Yeah, I can't remember exactly what game it is. I've been to so many.
Okay, but it was a Flyers-Rangers game, basically.
It was a Flyers-Rangers game, then the Flyers lost.
Okay. Rob?
There's an old story in Rich's family lore that when I was but a young lad, a young whippersnapper, my dad took me to a game. I believe this was against Florida at the Spectrum. And the Flyers took a dumb penalty, and so the Panthers vacated their crease and went the next man up. And so the Flyers the Panthers took a penalty. The Flyers vacated their crease to go a man up, and they're moving the puck in the Panthers zone. And they went to drop it to the point man. I believe it was Gary Galley. And but they missed the point man. The puck sails the length of the ice into the empty Flyers net.
Oh, own goal.
According to lore, as soon as that puck went into the net, I just started bawling my eyes out. But one of the first game I remember vividly was a game that I went to with my dad against Boston. We sat upstairs, and I remember being terrified that my dad was going to throw me into the Jumbotron. I don't know why. It was a very irrational childhood fear of mine. Dad, I apologize. And I think it might have been because not terribly long before that, I had watched the great Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Sudden Death, where there was a bomb in a Jumbotron. It's been a while since I've seen that movie. It's been far too long. But those are some of my earlier Flyer memories. They might be a little wackier.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, I'll have to say then, if Dan's point is supposed to be true, then I'm the exception to the rule. Because my first Flyers game in attendance was shortly after it was then called the Core State Center. Everybody knows it now as the Wells Fargo Center, obviously, but it was shortly after the Core State Center had opened. And this is in, I think, November of 1996. The Flyers were playing the Tampa Bay Lightning, and they came out with a 3-2 win, actually. Rod Brindamore scored 2 goals in that game, and I do distinctly remember that the last one, again, I've been cursed or blessed, depending on how you look at it, with a good memory. Rod Brindamore scored the game-winning goal with just under a minute left, and I remember it because of the fact that I remember seeing the scoreboard, which I thought was one of the coolest things at the time. Still do in some capacity, you know. I've always been fascinated with how a scoreboard works, especially the older fashioned ones. They're kind of becoming obsolete now, but that used to have the squared off numbering and things like that. But I remember it reading 59.8 or something like that. But the fact that they counted down the last minute by tenths of a second, which I had no idea what the heck that meant at the time, but I do remember that was who scored the game winning goal in the first game I was ever at. And, you know, I have a couple more good games I attended, you know, just in terms of, you know, that was my first way back, you know, in 1996. I'd yet to turn 5, I think, quite honestly, you know, so I was still very young, probably didn't understand. That's why I say I don't know how I know that Rod Brindamore scored twice in that game. I guess the magic of the internet at this point probably will help, but the fact that I would actually remember what game it was to know that Rod Brindamore scored twice somehow and had the game-winning goal. But whatever. 2 of the other games that I can say I attended, we just talked a whole lot extensively about the 2004 Stanley Cup playoff run that the Flyers had, and we talked a lot about Game 6 against Toronto. I actually attended the first game of the series in Philadelphia, a 3-1 win for the Flyers over the Maple Leafs. That was the first time I'd ever been to a playoff game. And my dad, taking me down there, even told me, prepare yourself for the noise level, because when they score, this isn't just going to another game, it's going to get loud. And the Flyers scored first in that game. Tony Amani got the first goal off of a kind of a rebound off of a Jeremy Roenick shot. And as it went up over the shoulder of Ed Belfour, that place did go nuts, for sure. And then, you know, I kind of laughed because the game-winning goal in that game went to Marcus Ragnarsson, who was kind of like I feel like no, not too many people remember he was a Flyer at one point in time. But it's just cool to be able to actually mention that happened. Simone Gagne also scored in that game, which was cool. And then that was the last playoff experience that everybody had. You know, the Flyers were making the playoffs consistently at that time. And there were no playoffs the following season with the lockout. So when the Flyers returned in 2005-2006, at that point in time, there was no 04-05 season. So when the 05-06 season came to be, and the Flyers at that point in time, too, had played their way through the first few months, were well on their way to having a playoff spot again, I got playoff tickets for my birthday that year. I was turning 14, and they ended up playing the Buffalo Sabres that year. So I had tickets to Game 4 of that series. And there are 3 things that I have that I remember, because that was the first year that Peter Forsberg was a Flyer. And that year was just, even though he was on the down, you know, in the twilight of his career by that point, and a Hall of Fame career at that, he was still so impressive to watch. And the first goal of that game for the Flyers, at least, they were down 2-0. And Peter Forsberg is in the attacking zone and literally circles the entire zone almost twice, really, before dropping the puck back to Eric Desjardins, who scored. And that was Desjardins' final goal in the NHL. Little did we know at the time, but I just always remember that. Forsberg later scored twice in that game. Funny enough, so did on Buffalo's end, so did Danny Briere twice. So just something to keep in mind there. But I just remember that whole experience, that game. The Flyers were down 2-1 in the series at the time. They had won Game 3 to get it to 2-1, and they had tied the series up after that. And it was just such a cool such a cool experience. Going to playoff games is incredible. And even, I go back, Rob, you said you were at game 6 against Washington a couple years ago, kind of on a whim.
Correct.
I covered it for us, for the site. And, I remember going down there, and during that game, a few of us were actually watching it from one of kind of like the tunnelways from one of the section entry zones, really. The Flyers ended up getting a 5-on-3 during that game. And right after the second penalty was taken, and the officials are making their announcement, Washington penalty. I don't remember exactly who it would have been on, but Washington penalty. The crowd is roaring. I mean, deafening cheers at that point in time, thinking it was a scoreless game. So thinking, here it comes. Here's the moment. Here's the opportunity. And I got to admit, it's a noise that I hadn't heard, a volume of the crowd that I hadn't heard in quite some time. It took me back to those couple of experiences that I had near teenage age, really, being a teenager, and thinking back to my first few playoff games. And once you've experienced it once, you can't wait to experience it again in whatever capacity. So, here's hoping soon enough that the Flyers are back in the playoffs so we can talk more about that kind of experience, because it's such a cool experience.
One of my favorites isn't a Flyers memory per se, but it's a Philadelphia hockey memory. I was a sophomore in high school. We had a ticket plan at the Spectrum for Phantom games. It was I think it was like a 10-game package. And I went to this game with my brother and my grandma. We were in the lower level, right behind the visitor penalty box. And it's a name which I will give anybody full credit if they can remember this name. But the Phantoms were killing a penalty. Kyle Greentree was out there on the kill. Went to send the puck down the length of the ice. SOP for penalty kills. And the puck, I guess, caught an omnipresent stick or what have you. But it tipped up over the glass into the crowd and a one-way collision course with my eyebrow.
Oh.
I did not see the puck coming. Felt like I got socked in the face. I looked down in my lap. There's a puck still frozen. And just the realization, I got hit by a puck. Obviously, there was some medical treatment involved with that. And I still have the puck. I still have the scar. And I still have the fond memory.
That's awesome. I mean, I'll give you this, too, because Phantoms games were always a blast. I went to my fair share of those as a kid. How much fun they were, and just watching, minor league hockey. A lot of times those Phantoms games were good for a line brawl here or there. You might get a goalie fight every now and then. It definitely was your way of watching old time hockey. So I definitely saw my fair share of cool things that you don't think about.
Especially in a historical barn like the Spectrum.
Yeah. Sure.
It still had its old charm. It had its old musty beer smell.
And apparently, let's just say, no joke, just a few days ago, I found a couple of old ticket stubs from games that were like in late 90s, like 1999, maybe 2000, 2001, something like that. Just a few. And little did I know, you could sit fairly close, lower level for like, at least as a kid, your ticket was like $8. And I'm like, I look at that now and I laugh because it's not even close anymore, but still, cool stuff. I'll throw out there, too, because I believe one of you guys did mention it already. Or Dan, I think you mentioned it a couple times, but you mentioned his first two. I have John LeClair's third 50th goal in 98 against Buffalo. It's immortalized on YouTube. You can go check that out. I watched it the other day, actually. A big slap shot right past Dominik Hasek. Just vintage John LeClair. And kind of is cutting back a little bit towards the slot a little bit because he's at the right face-off circle. And as he's cutting back, he's actually skating back towards the blue line after it goes in. And he just looks up skyward and then just pumps his arms up. To me, it's a snapshot that stands out. And John LeClair was my favorite player growing up for the Flyers. If I had to pick a Flyer that I was particularly fond of and enjoyed watching all those years in the 90s. And to know that he was consistently a 50-goal scorer and got to it again at that point in time. By that point in time, it was more prolific at the time. People were talking about it a lot more. It happened the first two times, and it was a big deal. But his trek to 50, I think, in that third year was much more documented. And I think there was a long wait between 49 and 50 at that point in time. So when he finally got it, it was dramatic and it was exciting and something that I remember that goal for sure.
Before we wrap this up, I did want to touch on two stories. You guys talked about your first playoff games. I want to talk about my little sister's first playoff game. It was Game 3 of the 2010 Eastern Conference quarterfinal against the New Jersey Devils. And it's adorable because they were 12 years old then, and they had never known hockey without a shootout. So that we're sitting there, it's 2-2. Brian Ralston had just tied the game, and they look over to me like, when does it go to a shootout? And I just start laughing. I'm like, oh no, this doesn't go to a shootout. We could be here all night, girls. And also the person who scored, because I wasn't a big fan of Dan Carcillo. Like, they had traded Scotty Upshaw, a player who I thought was useful, for Dan Carcillo, a player who I didn't think was useful. And then he's the one that pots it. And the entire place goes nuts. And on the ride back home, it was a school night. They look at me like, do we have to go to school tomorrow? And I'm like, no, you don't have to go to school tomorrow. So I'm sure that's something they remember.
Playoff hockey makes for great moments. I think we've definitely covered that here and made that clear. And hopefully sometime soon we've got new playoff moments to come, because for sure there's a lot we could, and again, this is something kind of like what we did last week. This is a show where feel free to tell us some of the things that we didn't talk about. We know that there's a lot of people, a lot of moments, a lot of games, a lot of memories that we could touch on throughout, our time watching the Flyers. For so many of you as listeners out there, we probably have listeners out there who have been through the entire 50 years and remember day one. And if you do, that's awesome. We certainly love people like that just as much as we like the new fans who come in, because it's important, to have the fan base continue to grow and continue to have generations that remember different things. I certainly believe that I am prouder to be doing what I'm doing. I appreciate it more by knowing the history, even if I didn't get to live it. But I also try to remember the stuff that I was watching and go back. And that's why we talked about last week when we mentioned the Legion of Doom and things like that. Go watch a clip on YouTube. Type in Legion of Doom and watch a few clips. It's amazing. And you may not remember it if you were, Rob and I are pretty much in the same boat. So if you were, 5-6 years old as the Legion of Doom was tearing up the league, go watch some clips. Because I don't even remember it being like that, but it's cool to watch. I remember it being good. I remember them being really good and being players that you like people I idolized. I don't remember it being like that. That it was on a whole nother level than the rest of the league could even do. And then the thing was, I was just watching clips from one of the, I believe it was one of the 97 games against the Rangers in the Eastern Conference Final, but I'm not 100% sure of that. And it was one of those playoff games, though. And there was a tic-tac-toe passing play that the Legion of Doom pulled off at one point in time, or at least a part of that line, because it was Lindros tipping it to Leclerc, and Leclerc goes in and scores on a breakaway. The next goal after that is Trent Klatt, John Druce, and Joel Otto or something like that. I'm probably have it all, a few people confused, but it's a similar tic-tac-toe play, and you're going, those were the lower-end players on those teams that made the same plays and made you go, wow, what got into these guys? So across the board, those were some good teams, and the highlights are pretty impressive given the era. The game has changed so much from that time, but you have an appreciation for it, and that's the cool part. So guys, any final thoughts before we sign off for this week?
I did want to share one last story. It's essentially why I do this, why I write for Flyerdelphia, why I even want to do this podcast. It started with the Eric Lindros trade. I was a big Eric Lindros fan, if you couldn't tell by the fact that I took him first overall last week. And when he got traded for essentially was a pretty poor return, at least in my opinion, Kim Janssen was the only really good player they got for him. It really irked me. And I didn't know how to vent that frustration. So I just started writing opinion columns. I was taking a class at school that was a TV class. You were doing a newscast, and I talked about the Eric Lindros trade, and I went after trading Jan Halovic for Donald Brashear. I essentially, and then I talked about how Eric Lindros was playing so well with the New York Rangers, and it just was that kind of passion where if Eric Lindros doesn't get traded, maybe I don't even do this.
It's certainly an interesting thought. I mean, I'll share the same kind of sentiment at this point in time, because for me, writing on this particular portion of the sites, writing on this particular subject on sportstalkphilly.com was something that brings my sports viewing in general full circle. Because I grew up on the Flyers more than anything, got very into baseball over the teenage years as the Phillies got better, kind of started to really peak around 2003 when the Vet was closing, and then as the new ballpark and Citizens Bank Park showed up, I really got into baseball for a few years. And not that I neglected hockey in any way, really, but the lockout does things to you. It wasn't because there was a whole year where there was no hockey, it wasn't must-see anymore. I'd still put the games on, but, it wasn't quite as much must-see as it used to be in my house, just because of the fact that a whole year had been lost, and there was some bitterness to that. But eventually it kind of came back around. I started writing baseball in particular when I was still in, I was a senior in high school, knowing I wanted to go to school for communication, for sports casting, sports writing, things of that nature, and started writing baseball stories and kept doing it a little bit. And I remember the first time I actually dabbled with a Flyer story was when the Winter Classic was held there in 2012. At the time, Sports Talk Philly had just started up, but was only doing baseball at the time, so we hadn't really ventured into hockey. But I threw something up there in a dead time for baseball on my own personal site, just as a way of saying, let me just write something on hockey. It's something different, it's something interesting, and I did. And then within another year, we were actually, within a year, because one lockout, another lockout comes that delayed that, but once we finally got going, I was back to writing hockey, and eventually I just took this up full force, and I'm glad I did, because it's one of the coolest things I get to do is to go down, to be there, to provide coverage of this team, even, through the good years and the bad. I've done this now, next year will be my 4th season doing credentialed coverage, and so far I'm 1 for 3 when it comes to playoff appearances. You get there, they've gotten there 1 year, 2 years they haven't, and there's been a coaching change in that time. There's been lots of different players coming in and out, but it's still worth it. It's worth it to see how other people react to it, because it's a passionate fan base, and I'd rather it be that way than be people who don't care. Rob, did you want to do anything on your involvement here, kind of how you got into this?
Yeah, I'm just pretty thrilled for the opportunity, I think, to have gotten involved. And Kevin, I really do have you to thank for that. It was something that I knew kind of going into school, something that I had wanted to get into. And, once I started writing for the college paper, writing was something that I kind of enjoyed doing, and hockey was something I enjoyed watching. So the two kind of coming together, I guess, is something I guess you could say it was an opportunity I think I would have loved to have enjoyed. And obviously, something I think that's worked to our advantage is, the rise of the internet, the age of the internet, and how if it's something you're interested in, just go right ahead and go right for it. And, getting involved with the site, I think, is something that's definitely been enjoyable, and it's something I have you to thank for.
Absolutely. And, well, hey, buddy, all I can say about that is that was one of the things we bonded over right away, was that we both could talk Flyers, and you had your obscure little references all the time, and it was nice to know that I could appreciate them, What did we do last week? We were getting ready to do the fantasy draft, and we were joking around about putting together 4th liners and stuff like that. And Rob drops the name Paul Ranheim, and I said, only if I get to have Jody home, stuff like that. The fact that at one point in time, Rob comes in sporting a Blair Betts jersey, and it's
still hanging in my closet.
He still has it. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be back next week with another new episode, getting a little bit closer to the start of the 2017-18 season. Still a few weeks away, but we're getting there. It'll be here before you know it. So once again, thanks for listening. For Rob, Riches, and Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia podcast on sportstalkphilly.com.
This has been another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning, presented by sportstalkphilly.com.